Intel's new 14th gen CPUs are here, but is this third iteration of the Alder Lake architecture enough to stave off the threat from AMD with their Ryzen 7000 and future Ryzen 8000 releases? Or is it a little bit too late, slightly rebaked, and not particularly good value? In today's video, we're gonna find out, and we're gonna do it in GeekaWhat style by building an awesome PC that pushes the new i5, i7, and i9 to their limits, to see whether or not these things really stack up for productivity and gaming applications. Let's do this. Let me start things off with a bit of useful context around these CPUs. Typically, Intel will retain the same CPU socket for 2 generations. We've seen this previously with 10th and 11th gen, it was what we expected with 12th and 13th gen, but Intel have decided to retain this socket for 1 more generation. Now, on one hand, this is good because it improves socket compatibility across a wider and older range of motherboards, but it also makes 14th gen significantly more of a refresh than something that's set to deliver ground-up new performance. We're expecting AMD to do a similar kind of thing where they retain the socket for their next Ryzen 7000, either upgrade with X3D or of course the 8000 generation. Now, Intel are releasing a range of new chips here, basically refreshing the whole lineup. I've got the i5-14600K and i9-14900K here at my disposal. The only thing to bear in mind with these chips is that we're not expecting the motherboards, including the new refreshed Z790 designs with extra features like Wi-Fi 7 in some cases, better power delivery, and Thunderbolt 4, to necessarily support the Intel 15th generation of CPUs, which we'd expect to see in about a year's time. The main objective, I suppose, with these chips from Intel is to hold off AMD's threat with their X3D chip, and some of the optimizations we've seen from Ryzen 7000. Remember, Intel started off on the front foot when it came to 13th gen, and quickly slipped, to be fair, a little bit behind. The Intel Core i5 chip has 14 cores and 20 threads, 6P cores and 8 E-cores, while the i9 has 24 cores and 32 threads, so unchanged on both of these chips from the previous generation. The i7 has been bolstered with a couple of extra cores. The i9 will be the focus of today's build though, hence the RTX 4090 and other high-end components. The major difference with this chip though has to be the clock speeds. Via Intel's thermal velocity boost technology, this thing actually boosts up to 6 GHz out of the box, and that's without any overclocking or other magic coming into play. The key thing about this thermal velocity boost tech though is that in order for it to work and be able to boost to those really high speeds, the CPU has to be running under certain stringent temperature thresholds. So although Intel is saying this is a 6 GHz CPU, it is, but only under the right cooling circumstance. Perhaps the biggest foreseeable downside with these chips though is their inability to rival AMD's X3D technology. X3D basically stacks the cache on the CPU and gives the chip far more L3 cache. Focusing on the i9-14900K, and you get 36 megs of L3 cache and 32 megs of L2 cache. When you compare this to the Ryzen 9 7950 X3D, perhaps this chip's most close competitor, while you have double the amount of L2 cache at 32 megs rather than 16, the L3 cache on the X3D chip is significantly bolstered with 128 megabytes on that 7950 X3D. And that's certainly something to bear in mind when you consider the impact that cache has on general performance. In terms of other baseline specs, both chips have a base power consumption of 125 watts, with the i9-14900K boosted up to a maximum of over 250 watts under load. Even without Intel's fancy boost that sits at 6 GHz, you still get a standard boost clock speed of 5.8, meaning you're still going to see awesome single-threaded performance all around. Now, of course, that's the advantage of the i9 running so quick. You get that amazing multi-thread with 24 cores and 32 threads, while also still getting the advantage of fast single-thread clock speed. Great for both gaming in newer, more optimized multi-core titles and older single-thread games, and of course for tasks like video editing and rendering, something the i9 was basically born to do. I'll be installing the i9 into this. Now, this here is the Asus TUF Z790 Pro Wi-Fi. This is part of a range of refreshed Z790 motherboard designs. The most notable features that we're seeing are Wi-Fi 7, though this board only has Wi-Fi 6 ears, is a little bit not on the cheaper side, but isn't the most expensive of all the options. Pretty much all the boards that I'm seeing all support DDR5 memory, though both both chips do support DDR4, this is certainly going out of date and out of fashion. You shouldn't be building a DDR4 system at the moment unless you're on a mega tight budget. And while these refreshed Z790 boards look a little pricey to begin with, they are going to provide an updated feature set and crucially, the BIOS update out of the box. That means you can run something like a 14900K, 147, 14600K without any dramas. To me, it makes sense to go for the most up-to-date motherboards and feature sets. But beware, we're not expecting the next 15th gen to use this socket, meaning boards like this are not going to work. If anything, I actually think that Intel have probably undersold the advantage of having 3 generations on the same socket. That's something that you want to really put out there when you first launch Z690 and the new socket design, because these chips can be used on Z790 and Z690 motherboards, and of course the B760 and B660 designs too. Though I imagine Intel didn't anticipate when they launched 12th gen that they'd be using the same socket and fundamental architecture points for 3 generations in a row. As far as other components go, I've also picked up 32GB of super fast Patriot Viper Extreme 5 memory. This is going to give us some really fast speeds. 32 gigs is fine for gaming. Video editing, rendering, maybe pick up 64 gigs for good measure. As far as storage goes, Samsung's SSD 980 4TB. No, 990 4TB is the way to go. I would say pick up the 980 to save some money, but this is actually cheaper. You don't necessarily need 4TB, 2TB would be fine. I'm going to go ahead and pop these bits into the motherboard now. It's always easier to complete as much of the motherboard assembly as you can outside of the box. There's nothing nicer than a box fresh motherboard. Oh, ho, ho, ho. What a beauty. I have to be honest, this is quite a nice design and I'm liking some of the things that Asus are doing aesthetically with their tough boards. I think they look really good. Features wise, DDR5 memory support, of course the LGA 1700 socket, USB 3.1 Type C Gen 2, USB 3 Type A, and of course our easy release for the PCI slot as well for good measure. Just pretty good. And crucially, as mentioned many times in today's video, the BIOS update that is required, or the BIOS version, sorry, I suppose it's required for, of course, these 14th gen chips. There's not really that much to look at with the new CPUs. They're very much not same old, but it's kind of tried, tested, and repeated once again. Pop that into the motherboard. There we go. Drop her in. Lovely stuff. Socket goes down. Arm into place. Nicely done. I will do some cooler prep in a minute as well, but first is, of course, time for the memory. This Patriot Viper 5 kit is rapid at 8,000 megahertz. I'm not even sure we're going to get it to 8,000 megahertz in this build, but it's rated at that speed, so we're going to see how high we can push it. And of course, the idea behind this is that I don't want to bottleneck the i9-14900K. I want to give it all of the horsepower and all the I can't get into this RAM. All of the component pairings that it could need to give us maximum performance. These are going to go in the grey slots, dual channel, nicely done. It's really kind of astonishing how cheap and good value DDR5 memory has become. Wasn't always that way, and I remember a couple of years ago using DDR4 all the time for 12th gen builds because of the value proposition. Of course, got PCI Gen 5 compatibility as well on these boards, both in terms of the M.2 slots and also the PCI slots for good measure. Just going to slide the drive in, push it down, and then of course got the little toolless latch. So clever, these toolless latches nowadays. Then of course pop the heat shield back on to complete the aesthetic. And of course make sure the drive stays nice and cool. That's going to be a massive problem with PCI Gen 5 NVMEs when they become mainstream in the next 12, 18 months. I mean, it might take longer if they can't get the temperatures under control. They run so hot, some of those Gen 5 drives. There we go. That's nicely installed though, and pretty much good to go. Now, with this being an Intel processor, I am going to prep the cooler earlier rather than later. And I have gone, I was going to say overkill, but given, of course, that velocity boost technology, not really particularly overkill. Having picked up this ROG Ryu 3 360mm ARGB. Now, I've used this cooler, I think, once before and quite liked it, to be honest with you. It's pretty insane. I mean, you've got these like quite nice Asus fans with like a metallic ring around, very fancy. They're of course going to light up and be controlled in Asus or a sync. Then you've got fans everywhere. The radiator, now look at this thing. This thing is a total monster. So really thick 360mm rad that feels super well built. Then got the water block. It's a slightly chunky water block, but it's got this cool pixel design on the top. And of course our copper contact plate on the bottom, which definitely needs a bit of a clean, having used it in a previous build. and then inside of the box, all the various mounting hardware that we could need, or at least I hope there is all the mounting hardware that we could need. It's actually pretty easy to do the prep here. We just need to pop the back plate through the rear of the motherboard, nice and easy, with the included posts then just screwing into each corner. This is the more fiddly bit, and this is the reason I would recommend doing it before the case gets involved, as trying to get the hands into the case to do this step does make things a bit more tricky and probably a bit more stressful as well, to be honest. And then once that's done, all the prep that we can do for now is essentially done. I'm going to install all this into a pretty nice case, actually. I've used it once before and actually really liked it. This is the Asus TUF GT, let me check the box, I'm terrible with numbers, 502. So it's an ATX case. It's got a little bit of that kind of dual chamber, Lian Li-esque sort of design inspiration, but it is pretty unique in the sense that it's got these nice rugged handles, you've got all the glass panels, the TUF branding. It's pretty gamery, pretty out there, but I wouldn't say outlandish or obnoxious in too many ways. Now, in terms of actually installing the motherboard, with these things, you always want to get the case laid down flat on the table. That's going to make life so much easier when it comes to installing the motherboard. So strip all the panels down, lay it flat on the table, and go from there. I'm just going to drop the motherboard into the case, get the I/O lined up, and then once it's in there, just give it a bit of a wiggle, make sure everything's all kind of seated and sitting correctly, and then it's 9 screws, 3 down the middle. I say 3 down the middle as I point to the bottom. 3 down the bottom, 3 across the middle, and 3 up the top. Basically, 9 screws in total. Nice and easy. To tell you the truth, if you put a couple in, it's gonna hold, but I would recommend, if your build's a long-term prospect, doing as many screws as possible. Then the motherboard is in. Now, as far as putting the radiator in, there are a few different options. So technically, this case supports top-mounted installations and bottom-mounted installations and side, not front, side-mounted. But in terms of actually trying to optimize for airflow, I think that the top makes the most sense, because then we can use the bottom of the case for intake, go for that sort of chimney thermal design philosophy. Putting it on the side's good, but it's where you then bring the air in to pull the air out. So I'm going to go ahead and put the radiator on the top. In order to do that, I'm going to add the fans to the radiator first, outside of the case, then install the radiator and fan assembly into the chassis. The water block is going to pop onto the post we installed earlier with a few thumb screws to secure it into place. Remember the thermal paste. Do not forget the thermal paste, as without that, you're in a world of trouble. The next part on the list is the GPU. Now, I have, of course, picked the RTX 4090. I actually haven't really been recommending that many NVIDIA cards as of late, but the 4090 does hold its top spot as the best gaming GPU on the market you can buy, full stop. This card is really, really phenomenal, tops all the performance charts, and has an impressive spec sheet that just makes it truly one of a kind when it comes to performance. But of course, it is very, very pricey. This is the moment of the build where I'm panicking as to whether or not it'll fit in the case. I think it should do with, loads of room, no need to worry. And you can see it's gonna fit the build aesthetic really well. It matches perfectly with the TUF gaming motherboard, matches perfectly with the case. It's just pretty spot on, really. Now, it is only a 2-slot design at the rear, although it's 3 slots wide, there's only 2 brackets that need taken out. So I'm gonna remove a couple of those brackets at the back of the case to make room for the GPU, then slide the whole thing in. I do always forget just how big and heavy these things actually are. Bit of pressure. Look at that thing. Unbelievable. Gonna add the screws back in, and then also we've got this cool little GPU support bracket, which I'm able to pop under the graphics card. A little something like this to actually prop it up and make sure that we minimize as much GPU sag as possible. And then really, the last couple of steps are just the power supply, which is conveniently located on the floor down here. I've picked up the new NZXT ATX3 C1200 Gold, and then of course, a couple of extra fans at the bottom to really support that chimney-esque airflow design. I think I'm gonna put 3 intake fans on the bottom of the case to pull the fresh air in, which will exhaust out of the top. I think the build though looks fantastic, and I have to give credit to Asus. Their GT502 is really easy to build in, and of course matches the 4090 and refreshed Z790 TUF motherboard really nicely indeed. And that has come together super nicely. So let me boot this up and let's take a look at performance on that 14th gen CPU and the build as a whole. I'll be starting off with synthetic benchmarks first, working through to gaming later. In Cinebench R23, the i9-14900K did beat out basically every other CPU on the graph, whether that be the Ryzen X3D lineup or Intel's Core i9-13900K that this replaces. But it didn't do it particularly decisively. It was a similar story in single thread, where in theory the high 6 GHz boost velocity clock speed of the 14900K should come into its own. 2268 again marginal over the 13900K. 3D Mark's CPU profile is a great way of analysing different scores on a per thread basis, and here we saw the max thread result was decently higher than the 13900K, but once again, not by a huge margin. Certainly not by enough that if the 13900K is discounted as a result of the new 14900K coming online, that the 14900K would actually lose as far as a value proposition goes. The performance gain is so small in many respects that it's going to more come down to pricing of CPUs than it is to availability. Take 3D Mark's Timespy Extreme, the CPU score, as another key example. The 14900K tops the charts, which feels great to say, but it does it only at a narrow margin. And there are even some benchmarks across both synthetic and gaming where the 14900K, for whatever reason, failed to beat out the 13900K. Now, in full transparency, we did have a few hiccups testing these CPUs. Whether it be motherboard presets that are automatically boosting CPU clock speeds, putting more voltage through the processors out of the box without us tweaking any settings, or overheating issues which meant we had to run our i9-14900K on a 420mm all-in-one RAD to actually see decent results. And it is often quite normal when you have CPU and GPU benchmark testing for some results just not to align exactly how you expect. To be clear, we're not exactly a million miles away, but it's just an example that the 14900K in our testing doesn't always win. Marvel's Spiderman is the first of our unified gaming tests, so this is with a 6950 XT, so we compare like for like across all different CPUs. I'll jump in just a second through to the gaming benchmarks for this build specifically, but I want to give you guys as much data as possible. The 14900K beat out the 13900K by 3 frames per second. We're definitely seeing perhaps more of a ceiling in terms of frame rate here. 1080p you are going to be CPU constrained, and that's why the i9-14900K delivers such strong performance compared to something like an older Ryzen 9 5900X with the same settings and same GPU. Move through into 4K and you'll see the 14900K once again wins 4 FPS in it this time. There really isn't great margins when it comes to the frame rate upside. But is the 14900K technically the fastest gaming CPU on the market? The answer to that question is probably yes. Move through into Apex Legends at 4K high and we get another 2 frames per second from the 14900K. We'll drop down to 1080p and a number of our top-end CPUs hit the limits when it comes to that 300 FPS cap in Apex. Move through into F1 2022 to round things off. The reason we're using 2022 rather than 2023 is because we have all of the data. Here the 14900K wins by 2 FPS at 1080p and by a more resounding 6 FPS at 4K. The 14900K then from our testing, certainly not a bad CPU, just not anything particularly incredible. When paired up with the RTX 4090 in this build though, we did see really good gaming results across the board, even if perhaps the 14900K isn't much of an upgrade on the 13900K. 98 FPS on average at 4K high settings in Starfield is one example. Consistent 90 and 99 percentiles led to a good gaming experience. Hogwarts Legacy, much the same story. 4K high, 107 FPS. Really playable, really enjoyable gaming experience. Warzone 2 at 4K high with DLSS set to quality, delivered 138 FPS on average. 90 and 99 percentile results once again in a good region, while we saw one of our best results ever in Fortnite at 1080p. The reason being it's a great test of the CPU bottleneck in the system with 321 FPS on average here. Apex settings were pretty good. 4K high, we achieved 257 frames per second from the RTX 4090 and i9-14900K. You might notice from our graph earlier that we got higher frames on the 6950 XT. That's just an oddity. Some of the top-end AMD cards always perform really well in Apex. So what's my conclusion in all of this? The answer is I don't really know. And it's the first time I've ever said that for a launch of a new product. On one hand, I feel really quite conflicted that the 14900K is really a 13900K plus. And while Intel have made it clear that this is just a refresh, it's not exactly what people want, or in my view, what people deserve. And there are many people, particularly gamers, who are not going to do the level of research into watching a video like this that will expect the 14900K to be sizably better than the 13900K, just as that CPU was to the 12900K that it replaced. Does it perform badly? No. Should you buy it? I'm not really sure. And to be honest, I don't think I would. I'd much rather pick up a 13900K, give it a modest overclock, and hope that that chip comes down in price a little bit in the wake of the 14th gen launch. You can find our full written coverage below. This is probably the most conflicted I've felt for a CPU launch in a long while. A little disappointed, but nothing unexpected.